Welcome to our fourth class on the book of Daniel. My name is John Galloway. I'm from East Kilbride in Scotland. This particular lesson was presented on Thursday evening, 28th of January 2021, in a Zoom class for the British Bible School as the UK continues in lockdown because of the coronavirus. This is the outline that we're using for our study. And as we're on our fourth lesson, we will be in chapter 4. And in this particular chapter, we're going to be looking at another dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and the result of that, him going into exile. This chapter opens with Nebuchadnezzar speaking to the people of his nation, praising the Most High God. John Lennox, in his commentary against the flow, said this: Chapter 4 is cast in the shape of a statement by the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar, in which he testifies to his personal experience of God. As a powerful testimony of a world leader to his faith in God, this section of Daniel is a remarkable piece of literature, and it must have attracted considerable interest in the ancient world, just as a similar statement by one of our present world leaders would today. World leaders, at least in the West, do not usually do God, as the saying goes. Nebuchadnezzar did. And we could add lots of things in there about recent politicians, but we're not going to do that. In Aramaic, this chapter, the beginning of this chapter, the first 3 verses, is actually a continuation of chapter 3, with chapter 4 not beginning until verse 4. So some have suggested that this could be the end of the previous incident. But when we compare this with the end of chapter 4, it seems to me that most likely it goes with the events of this chapter. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, gives a possible date for this incident. The Greek Old Testament, the Bible Study Notes tells us, has the following addition. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he said, and it goes on. This date would suggest a link to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Just to look at where all this occurs on our timeline. In chapter 3, we think, if again the Septuagint indicated it was around 586 BC. And if this is taking place around that time, maybe just a bit after, that would put chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's dream and then exile, just after that. There are other options, and we'll go into those later in our lesson. Nebuchadnezzar, as he opens up this chapter, praises God for all that God had done for him, giving great signs and wonders, and emphasizing that God had an everlasting kingdom. He wanted all people to get to know the Most High God. It's in verse 4 that he begins to relate another dream which he had one day while relaxing, contented, and happy in his palace. Homer Haley, in his commentary, commented, the precise time of this experience in the history of Nebuchadnezzar is not stated in the Aramaic text, but the words of the king, as quoted by Daniel, indicates that it was sometime after his conquests of the world powers foretold by Jeremiah. He was at rest in his house, flourishing, luxuriant, fresh in his palace. All these expressions indicate a time of peace and tranquility throughout his empire. So I think we can definitely say this is taking place after the conquest of Jerusalem. And I think after all of his conquests, I think Haley points out accurately that this is a time of peace for the Babylonian Empire. This dream that he had terrified him. He didn't know what it meant. He did what he seems to have always done, what all rulers of this time period would do. He called in his wise men to interpret it for him, but they couldn't come up with anything. At last, Daniel came in. Now, he comments a bit about Daniel, that he was the one that Nebuchadnezzar had given the name of Belteshazzar, named after Nebuchadnezzar's god. He goes ahead to point out that his god was actually Marduk. And it was Marduk, we know historically from documents, was called Bel, which apparently means Lord. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar, in what he's relating here, uses both Daniel's Hebrew name and his Babylonian name, both Daniel and Belteshazzar. John Lennox points out something that's important about this, though. He said Nebuchadnezzar's polytheism is still not far from the surface. He is a man on a journey, still confused, but wishing nevertheless to testify to what Daniel's God has done for him. We saw back in chapter 2 and chapter 3 that he's been introduced to Daniel's God and seems to have added him to his plethora of gods. Now, we're not told why Daniel was late arriving. Perhaps he was aware elsewhere on the king's business, and it took him a while to get there. We're just not told. In Daniel, though, Nebuchadnezzar points out, was the spirit of the holy gods. Although his wise men couldn't give him interpretations, Daniel could because he was the real thing. He told Daniel his dream because he knew that Daniel could find an interpretation for it. The Masoretic text, by the way, may be reflected in the King James Version group of Bibles, but the Masoretic text has Daniel required to give the dream and the interpretation as in chapter 2. But as we can see in the translations that we use not based on that text, Nebuchadnezzar relates the dream first, and then Daniel interprets it. What he saw in his dream was an extremely tall tree. Now, this tree here may not be extremely tall, but it is very wide, and I think it serves the purpose of seeing the type of tree that it might have been. But this tall tree was in the middle of the land. The phrase there, middle of the land, can also mean it was in the center of the earth, and some translations have that. It grew and became strong until it reached to heaven, and it can be seen all over the kingdom or all over the earth. The Aramaic text seems to indicate that the tree grew as he was watching it. It had beautiful leaves and abundant fruit. It was both good to look at and very practical. It provided food. The animals in the field, or it could be a reference to the wild animals, took shelter under it. The birds lived in the branches. All were able to eat from it. What this is telling us is that this is a very good tree. He went on and he saw a holy sentinel, a watcher, come down from heaven. The Aramaic literally says a watcher and a holy one, not referring to two, but to one person who's both a watcher and a holy one. When the Greek translated this in the Septuagint, they used the word angelos here. And you may recognize that word because that's where we get our word angel. The idea seems to be a messenger. That's what the New International Version has. That's what the New Living Translation has. Of course, messenger is the literal translation of the Greek word angelos. And so he's some sort of a heavenly messenger, a heavenly watcher. Homer Haley commented about this word and said the word indicated a vigilant one who is constant, watchful, keeping a diligent watch over all. Now, some translations have suggested these are angelic watchers, and that could be possible, although we need to realize that not all heavenly beings are necessarily angels. And so, some sort of a watcher, some sort of a messenger. This being calls out loudly. We've commented in past classes that everything in the holy realm seems to be loud. He calls out loudly that the tree was to be cut down, its branches lopped off, with its leaves stripped and its fruit scattered. The animals and birds would flee from it. Homer Haley said it would be stripped of its former glory and the great benefits to man, beasts, and birds, which they had looked to for sustaining life, had ended. The taproot, though, was to be left, with the stump bound with a band of iron and bronze in the grass of the field. Bible Study Notes comments that literal Aramaic here is the stock of its roots. And we have that same thing down in verse 23. The implication here is that although the tree is chopped down, it's not killed. Its life-giving root is spared. The application to Nebuchadnezzar is obvious. The function of the band of iron and bronze is not entirely clear, but it may have had to do with preventing the splitting or further deterioration of the portion of the tree that was left after being chopped down. By application, it would then refer to the preservation of Nebuchadnezzar's life during the time of his insanity. I think that is as good as any explanation of what the bands were, although some have suggested there may be symbolism in the bands. By the way, I couldn't find a picture of a tree stump with the bands around it, so here's a stump anyway. But some suggest there may be symbolism in these bands, and some suggest that it refers to the characteristics of the later kingdoms of Greece and Rome. Greece represented by the bronze and Rome represented by the iron, and which were part of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He had those characteristics as well. And that could be. And it is true that there were parts of it. There's really no real indication that there's a further symbolic meaning other than the preservation of the stump and the root. The Aramaic text says, "Let it be wet with dew. Let it live with the animals in the grass," or with the plants, maybe a better translation there. Let its mind be changed from a man's to an animal's. And there the Aramaic has "it's not his," although some of our translations have gone with his. And then let 7 periods go by for him. And there we do have the switch in the Aramaic from "it's" to "him," changing from something that's inanimate to something who is a person. In fact, the Aramaic, apparently, the Bible Study Notes tells us, has "let its heart be changed," not its mind. The metaphor of the tree begins to fade here, and the reality behind the symbol, the king, begins to emerge. The 7 periods of time, it suggests, probably refer to 7 years, although Homer Haley at this stage commented that until 7 times pass over him is not to be interpreted to mean 7 years, 7 seasons, or 7 months, but 7 being the number of perfection or the complete number. It meant until that for which the madness would be sent upon him would be accomplished. It referred to an indefinite time for the complete accomplishment of a divine purpose. We'll talk more about the 7 when we see it later on down in the text. But this was decreed so that all alive would know that the Most High rules over all the kingdoms of men and could appoint whomever he wanted to rule the kingdom. In other words, this is telling Nebuchadnezzar, this is telling us that God was in control. So Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and he desperately wanted to know what it meant, which of course his other wise men couldn't interpret, but he's confident that Daniel can, because he had the spirit of the holy gods in him. This dream terrified Nebuchadnezzar. And perhaps when we see it's about a tree being cut down, we might suspect that he is figuring out what this is about, that it's very well about him. Daniel was upset by the dream. I think when he heard the dream, he knows what it's about. And he sees it's not a good dream. He's upset. That Bible says it's for a brief time. The Aramaic literally is, he was upset about 1 hour. And that Bible study note says this expression refers idiomatically to a brief period of time of undetermined length. So it's brief, but we don't know how long it is. So he's upset. Nebuchadnezzar, though, tells him, don't worry. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, I need to know what this means. I think in this interchange here between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar that we can see the relationship that these two have. And I think it was a good relationship. It's interesting, Daniel doesn't want to give the king bad news. In fact, he expressed that he wished that this dream was for the king's enemies and those who hated him. He goes on to explain the dream. The tree in the dream, the great, wonderful, spreading tree, was the king himself. The tree is Nebuchadnezzar. John Lennox in his commentary says, it's striking that all three stages of God's self-disclosure to Nebuchadnezzar, chapters 2, 3, and 4, focus on something of immense size. Chapter 2, we had the colossal dream statue. Chapter 3, an actual colossal statue, a golden statue. And in chapter 4, a colossal dream tree. He goes on to say each of them is saying something about Nebuchadnezzar. He is the imposing head of gold in the dream image. He is the eminence gris that lurks thinly disguised behind the golden image, and the great tree that looms over the land. One gets the impression that Nebuchadnezzar was a big man in every sense of the word. After all, he was the ruler of the biggest, most powerful empire in the world at that time. Trees, by the way, are used in Scripture to speak of political authority, referring to kings, nations, empires. Ezekiel does that in chapter 17, Hosea in chapter 14. We find it in Zechariah, the first part of Zechariah 11, and even in Luke chapter 23, verse 31. Nebuchadnezzar had grown and had become quite strong. His kingdom had. Like the tree, as the emperor of the largest empire in the world, he gave protection and food to many nations. Now, keep in mind in all of this that this is God's assessment of Nebuchadnezzar. This is what God is saying about him. Now, we don't have a time frame in the Aramaic text for this dream. We do in the Greek, but not in the Aramaic. I think we can safely assume, because of what it's describing here, that this is towards the latter part of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Maybe around the fall of Jerusalem, maybe sometime after the fall of Jerusalem, but after he completed his great building projects. Nebuchadnezzar, we know, historically reigned from 605 to 562. So I would suggest that this needs to fall sometime in the latter part, or the early part of the 580s, or the latter part of the 570s during his reign, sometime in that. And just to fill in the picture of the Babylonian rulers that followed after Nebuchadnezzar, we know that he dies in 562. He is succeeded by his son Amel-Merodach. He's also known as Evil Merodach in Scripture. He only reigns for parts of 2 years. He's followed by Neriglissar, who reigns from 559 to 556, who is followed by Labish-Marduk in just the 1 year, 556. You can see several of these have the name of Nebuchadnezzar's god. And he's followed by Nebuchadnezzar, who reigns from 555 to 539. Now, 539, of course, is when the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. You might be asking, where is Belshazzar? Well, we're going to discuss that maybe briefly in our next lesson, but definitely in the lesson that follows that, how he fits in with the history. If this is 586 BC, as the Septuagint states, just after the fall of Jerusalem, Daniel would be in his late 30s by that point in his life. If it's later, 10 to 15 years later, he could be in his 40s or even his 50s by this point. The interpretation of the dream was that the king would be driven from men and live with the wild animals. Literally there, it says live with the beasts of the field. I think it is referring to wild animals. He would be eating grass like an ox. He would be wet with dew. I think that indication there is that he's going to be living outside for a period of 7 times, 7 periods of time, as the Net Bible expresses it. Josephus recorded that this was a 7-year period in his Jewish history. Many accept that as being what it is. We saw the Net Bible study notes goes that particular direction. Some scholars, as we saw that Homer Haley does, suggest this is an indefinite period of time. It would be until Nebuchadnezzar was willing to acknowledge that God was over all. And they key that off of the number 7, which in apocalyptic literature indicates fullness and completeness. And some also suggest that it could be a reference to 7 seasons, 3.5 years, because they referred to a season as being summer or winter. So that'd be 3.5 years. And it is maybe of note that there is a 4-year period recorded in an inscription that Nebuchadnezzar was ill for that long, which some suggest could be a reference to what happened here. And that could be. But we do know that this would be until he knew that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and was in control. Again, I would tend to go with Homer Haley, that the 7 times is not 7 years, months, or any specific duration of time, but a definite period of indefinite length. The king's condition will continue until the objective of the Most High is accomplished, whatever the necessary length of time may be. And as this would be until he acknowledged God, I like the idea, I think, more of being a definite period of indefinite length until that happens. And so that's what I'm going to suggest. But of course, it could be 7 literal years. The idea of leaving the root and stump was that the kingdom would be left for him to return to. Again, that's showing both Nebuchadnezzar and us that God was in charge. Daniel then took the opportunity to give the king some advice. And his advice is this: change your ways. Stop sinning. Begin to live right. And show mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps if he was to do this, then his good days might be lengthened, and either delay this happening to him, or possibly even this might not happen to him. John Lennox comments a bit on that. According to God's analysis of his life, Nebuchadnezzar had 3 principal character flaws. The first 2 were that he had neglected righteousness and had shown insufficient mercy to the oppressed. God regarded these failures as so serious that the emperor would have to endure a lengthy period of discipline that would involve him losing his reason and being excluded from human company to eat grass like an ox. He would eventually be restored, but not until he realized that God ruled in the kingdoms of men. The third character flaw, thirdly, like many powerful men, Nebuchadnezzar was guilty of an overweening pride. Coupled with his lack of moral integrity and humanitarian mercy, this trait fueled a driving ambition to create an aesthetic legacy that bore the unmistakable stamp of his name. I have a photograph of a brick in Babylon with his name stamped on it from the British Museum. British Museum, though, exercises copyright over all images that are taken in the British Museum, so I can't show that to you in this particular video. But we do know that did happen. Daniel seems to be suggesting, though, that if the king were to change, he just might avert this crisis. But of course, as we're going to read, he didn't. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on Daniel, Be Resolute, says, Daniel was calling for repentance. He wanted the king to change his mind, acknowledge his sins, turn from them, and put his faith in the true and living God, the Most High God of the Hebrews. Nebuchadnezzar knew enough about Daniel's God to know that what Daniel spoke was the truth, but he did nothing about it. The king was passing up a gracious opportunity to make a new beginning and submit to the will of the Most High God. He made the wrong decision, and I think he's absolutely correct. We see from the text that this happened just like Daniel interpreted the dream as saying it would happen. It was a year later that Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the battlements or the roof of the palace. And by the way, in the Aramaic text, there's no word for either battlements or roof, that he was walking around the royal palace. But he seems to be up high because he can see over the city. So the idea of being the roof or the battlements seems to be correct. By the way, if it is a roof, keep in mind that these buildings would have flat roofs. They're constructed. Buildings in the Middle East still are today, where you can use the roof as a sort of balcony. That's where you get the breezes, especially in the evening. It would seem that by having a delay of a year, that possibly God was giving him time to repent. But, of course, we know Nebuchadnezzar didn't change. What he was doing when he was out walking was looking over the city. And he began to praise himself for all that he had done. Notice what he says there. Is this not the great Babylon that I have built for a royal residence by my own mighty strength and for my majestic honor? F.W. Farrer, and his commentary in the Expositor series, wrote, the sight of that golden city in the zenith of its splendor may well have dazzled the soul of its founder. He tells us in an inscription that he regarded the city as the apple of his eye, and that the palace was its most glorious ornament. He seems very struck on what he had done. He was at the pinnacle of his reign as king. He was the greatest ruler on the entire earth, having defeated not only Judah and Jerusalem, but Syria, Arabia, Phoenicia, Assyria, Egypt. We have extensive descriptions of Babylon at this time from archaeology. Apparently, these have been translated into 126 texts. Here's just a brief summary of some of those. This is from by John Goldinghay. It's from the Word Biblical Commentary on Daniel. The palace from which he surveyed Babylon was one of the citadels on the north side of the city. It had large courts, reception rooms, throne room, residences, and the famous hanging gardens, a vaulted terrace structure with an elaborate water supply for its trees and plants, apparently built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median queen. From the palace, he would see in the distance the city's 27-kilometer outer double wall, which he had built. His palace stood just inside the double wall of the inner city, which was punctuated by 8 gates and encircled an area 3 kilometers by 1 kilometer, with the Euphrates running through it. The palace adjoined a processional avenue that Nebuchadnezzar had paved with limestone and decorated with lion figures emblematic of Ishtar. This avenue entered the city through the Ishtar gate, which he had decorated with dragons and bulls, emblems of Marduk and Bel. It continued south through the city to the most important sacred precincts, to whose beautifying and development Nebuchadnezzar had contributed. The ziggurat crowned by a temple of Marduk, where the god statue resided. In Marduk's temple, there were also shrines to other gods, and in the city elsewhere, temples of other Babylonian gods, restored or beautified by Nebuchadnezzar. Pharaoh commented that the walls were 380 feet high, 85 feet thick, of course a double wall, and were 15 miles in length on a side, forming a quadrilateral, covering a space of 200 square miles. Aristotle wrote that 3 days after Babylon's capture, some of its inhabitants were still unaware of that fact, indicating the immense size of Babylon. We have artifacts, some can be seen in the British Museum, that come from Babylon. Bits of the Ishtar Gate are there, and again, I can't show you those because of the copyright restrictions that the British Museum places on showing pictures of objects, that even those I've taken there in the British Museum. But I did find these on the internet. This is from the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. This is a model of the Ishtar Gate. I found this, by the way, on Wikipedia Commons, so it's freely licensed to be able to be used. But this is a model there in the museum in Berlin. Again, it shows the Ishtar Gate, and we shows that main procession street that led up to it. Also in the Wikipedia article, there is this photograph here of the in situ remains that they found in 1930 as they excavated the Ishtar Gate. So it was still intact when it was found and uncovered in the 1930s in Babylon. This gate has been reconstructed with all of its living color in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. Also found there and reconstructed is the inscription that was on the gate. It's in cuneiform. You can see some of the letters there, quite large letters. And Nebuchadnezzar did this, or had it done. It was glazed over, so it's preserved it very nicely. An abridged excerpt of what this says is, I, of course referring to Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates down to the groundwater level, had them built out of pure blue stone. Upon the walls of the inner room of the gate are bulls and dragons, and thus I magnificently adorned them with luxurious splendor for all mankind to behold in awe. Yes, indeed. Very similar to what he was saying there in Daniel chapter 4. It's the reason I thought it would be a good idea to show that. Again, the gates of the Ishtar Gate, decorated with oryx, apparently, which are referred to as bulls, and with dragons, of course, lions in the procession street leading up to the gate. Oryx, symbols apparently of Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's main god. Dragons apparently represented Adad, from what I read. John Golding said that representing Bel. Of course, Bel, I think more accurately, is probably just another reference to Marduk. So this may be Adad. It's one of the Babylonian gods anyway. And in addition to that, the Mesopotamian lions lining the street leading up to it, representing Ishtar. Those three figures, those three Pictures, by the way, are from pixabay.com, which are free to use as well. John Lennox commented that he made it a glorious city. He had also ensured that everyone was aware that he was responsible for its magnificence by having his name stamped on the vast majority of the bricks that were used. As we commented, you can see at least one of those, you see some of those in the British Museum in London. It was at this point that as he was looking out over all he had done, praising himself, that a voice came from heaven. He would lose his kingdom. He would be driven from men. He would be made to dwell with animals. Everything that the dream had said happened. You know, it almost would appear that he'd forgotten about the dream, doesn't it? He would be in this condition, living as an animal, until he knew that the Most High ruled the kingdoms of men. He was driven out and began to live like an ox. This is a depiction of Nebuchadnezzar by William Blake. Now, there's a copy of it, at least, in the Tate Gallery. This one is from, again, Wikimedia Commons, so it's freely licensed to be used. My guess is that he went insane. I think the text seems to indicate this. He was driven out as a result, as I cannot see anything else that would cause people to turn on their very own powerful and successful king. The Net Bible Study Notes commented that Nebuchadnezzar's insanity has features that are associated with the mental disorder of boanthropy, which the person so afflicted imagines himself to be an ox or a similar animal and behaves accordingly. Joyce Baldwin suggested that it was from lycanthropy, which is a fairly acute onset of insanity with apparent delusional idea that he was an animal. This, by the way, is where we get the idea of werewolves comes from, lycanthropy. R.K. Harrison calls it a rare form of monomania, a condition of mental imbalance in which the sufferer is deranged in one significant area only. There is a fragmentary cuneiform text that refers to some mental disorder on Nebuchadnezzar's part, and would seem to refer to his neglecting and leaving Babylon for a time. Josephus also referred to an illness of which Nebuchadnezzar eventually died. But I will call your attention to the length of his hair, the length of his nails here in this photograph, because I don't think we're going to come back to it, that we're going to go ahead and have a description of in just a minute. But he lives outside with the animals. Homer Haley commented that this was a pathetic... John Lennox comments that whatever it was, the text of Daniel attributes its onset to the direct intervention of God and emphasizes its behavioral aspect. Nebuchadnezzar began to live like an animal and was eventually driven out from human company. And as we commented, his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers. His nails became like bird claws, as we saw in that portrayal. This is Homer Haley's comment. This is a pathetic picture for a great monarch, the conqueror of the world. I thought that was a good observation. John Lennox said, Nebuchadnezzar's descent into the intellectual darkness of animal behavior is clearly an extreme case, but nonetheless one that illustrates an important general principle. I think this is worth pointing out, making an application of what happened to him. The darkening of intellect is a topic that's picked up in the New Testament, when Paul describes how rejection of God ultimately has a negative effect on the mind. He speaks of those who, although they knew God, did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Of course, that's a quote from Romans chapter 1. I thought that's a good application of what can even happen to us if we allow our intellects to reject God, as Nebuchadnezzar literally happened to him literally when he rejected God. Legend or tradition or whatever you want to call it has it that Babylonian officials during this time period took Nebuchadnezzar's son Marduk and made him king during this period. Of course, what Nebuchadnezzar is relating moves on very quickly. And at the end of this time, his reason returned to him. He acknowledged God, and it's, I think, of significance that the first thing he does is lifts his eyes to heaven to bless, to praise, to honor the Most High. He acknowledges that God had all power and that no one should question him. Apparently, Nebuchadnezzar had been doing that. It seems as that this entire chapter is Nebuchadnezzar's telling of what had happened to him after the event. If that's true, we can see from the opening verses that he was not worshiping God exclusively, though, just that he acknowledged him and had added extolling the Most High to his list of deities. Homer Haley made this point. One may ask, is there anything lacking in the eulogy, decree, and confession? There seems to be one thing. He is the only God. And that was the emphasis Haley had in his commentary. Unless something in what the king said included this idea, the recognition of the God of heaven as the only God, thereby rejected all pagan gods, falls short of the ultimate goal desired by Jehovah. Yes, he comes to a belief in God, but seems to be a belief in God as one of a plethora of gods which he acknowledged. Maybe he regarded Yahweh as the greatest of them. God did give him back his kingdom, his majesty, his splendor. Again, legend or tradition or whatever you want to call it, has it that when Nebuchadnezzar returned to power, he threw his son into prison for life. After Nebuchadnezzar died, his son Marduk did ascend to the throne, as we saw earlier, for that brief time. Nebuchadnezzar was once again established in his kingdom, with counselors and lords seeking him. In fact, he received more greatness than he had had before. But there was a difference. He now praised and honored the King of Heaven, for his works were right and his ways just, and he humbled those who walked in pride. John Lennox says that Nebuchadnezzar had thought that he towered above his people and his empire. He discovered that, along with all other inhabitants of the world, he was as nothing in comparison with God. He was eventually brought to see how big God is, and bowed his head and heart to honor and praise him for the rightness and justice of his ways. And this, by the way, is the last time we will encounter Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. We don't have information anywhere about the last years of his reign, nothing in the biblical text, nothing from secular texts either, from what I understand. Undoubtedly, they did exist because they meticulously recorded the reigns of the kings, but apparently they've not yet been found. But that's what I learned through my research. Homer Haley made this final application. But inasmuch as Daniel's position at the court of Babylon continued into the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus, it's wished that his influence on Nebuchadnezzar might have led him to a complete acceptance of Jehovah as the only true God, and to a complete rejection of all false gods. I think that's a hope we can definitely have, because he seems to have been, besides being an emperor, that he had some really good qualities. But there's no record, sadly, that ever happened. What is it that we can learn from Daniel 4? Again, keying off the theme of the book as we've expressed it, that God's in control. One thing we see here is God is in control not just of those who acknowledge him, not just of believers, but also of those who do not believe in him. By the way, that may be a good commentary on society today, who thinks that they can reject God and that then it won't affect them. It doesn't quite work that way, as Nebuchadnezzar discovered. Warren Wiersbe said, the grand lesson God wanted the king to learn, that we must learn today, is that God alone is sovereign and will not permit mortals to usurp his throne or take credit for his works. We are but creatures, and God is the creator. We are only subjects, but he is the King of Kings. When men and women refuse to submit themselves to God as creatures made in his image, they are in grave danger of descending to the level of animals. And we saw that quote from Romans that John Lennox included as well. Another lesson would be that even world leaders are subject to God. And maybe the idea also in this is that God is the one who allows whoever it is in any nation to be in power. And in light of recent events and recent political leaders we've seen in various parts of the world, sometimes we might question that. But keep in mind, even Nero, God allowed him to rule. God allows whoever's in any nation to be in power. Again, we're going to see some of that when we get into the vision section of Daniel. Homer Haley, though, commented on that. He said, this may be difficult for one to accept, but be assured in faith that this is so. God allows rulers to rule. But one thing I think we can definitely see in this chapter is that God humbles the proud. John Lennox wrote, I may not have built Babylon, but there will be lesser achievements that will tempt me to pride. There's nothing wrong in enjoying the aesthetically beautiful things in life, but it's possible that our indulgence in them can take our eyes off the need to be considerate of others who are not so fortunate. If we've been given intellectual ability, artistic or musical talent, business acumen, or aptitude in 1,001 directions, how easy it is to think that somehow we are the source. That's what we see in Nebuchadnezzar, isn't it? Look at all that I have done. But we can do that as well. We need to be careful that we don't succumb to pride. And maybe going along with that, we must not be like Nebuchadnezzar and follow our desires, doing just whatever we want to. Again, John Lennox commented on this. He said that we face this also. This is a hedonistic age, the one we live in, and we are encouraged on all sides to follow our desires, whatever they are, to do our own thing. God is represented as the great inhibitor, and people are encouraged to rid themselves of these non-existent gods that stifle human flourishing. The only limit on behavior is that which is set by the law of the land in terms of causing harm to others, although how this might be measured is another matter. That's so true, isn't it? The people will do whatever they want to. After all, it's not illegal, sometimes we hear. But some things that may be legal are not moral. Some things that may be legal, we definitely should not be involved in as God's people. Another lesson is that we need to acknowledge our indebtedness to and our dependence on God. And don't forget to thank him for what he does. It's not us, it is him. Again, John Lennox said, expressing gratitude to God is likewise an acknowledgement of indebtedness and dependence upon him. It's here that humans in their pride tend to go wrong. They will not acknowledge that they are dependent upon someone higher than themselves. We have no masters is their cry. Nebuchadnezzar was one of them. I think we can add to that. Let's make sure that we are not one of them. And the last lesson I thought would be worth bringing out is this. We need to use the influence we have for good. You see, we don't know what influence we might have over someone. And I get the impression in contrasting Daniel chapters 2, 3, and 4 that Daniel had a good influence over Nebuchadnezzar. Think about this. In chapters 2 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams, has people who defy him. And what do we see? We see fits of rage. And yet we get to chapter 4, he has a dream that terrifies him, but no anger. No anger when the wise men couldn't interpret his dream. No threats of executing them. And even when Daniel gives him the meaning of the dream, which is not very favorable, he seems to have calmly accepted what his punishment was going to be. It's Homer Haley that suggested that application. I think it's a good application. He said, and this is where we'll end our study this time, the chapter also teaches that one faithful man, a Daniel, at a king's court in such a time might influence his peers to lead a complete change of history. For God is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. We need to use our influence, don't we? We need to influence people for the good because we don't know who we might influence and what that might lead to. Thank you for participating in our study of Daniel and this lesson on Daniel chapter 4. I hope that this has been of benefit to you and that you can join us for our next lesson.